All right, so for chapter 18, we are looking at modern imperialism, and we're asking a simple question. How did Europeans build 19th century empires, and what did colonial rule do to the lives of people in Africa, Asia, and Oceania? So I want to start by connecting the past. This is what you're like straight from the chapter, right? Between 1904 and 1908, Germany committed genocide against the Herero people in what is now Namibia. And after it became independent in 1990, its government pressured Germany for an apology and compensation. And Germany became the largest donor of developmental aid and returned human remains taken during the violence. But negotiations about a formal apology and reparations remained unresolved as of 2020. And that opening example matters because it shows colonialism wasn't just administration. It included extreme violence, and its consequences are still being debated today. Let's zoom out a little bit now. For millions of Africans, Asians, and Pacific Islanders, colonial rule was the biggest new element in their historical experience during the long 19th century and into the mid-20th. And one important point, colonialism, it's not the same everywhere. Colonial policy changed depending on the empire and the moment in time. And colonized peoples shaped colonial rule through cooperation, resistance, and adaptation. Now, why did imperialism expand so rapidly in the 19th century? And a huge answer is industry. Factories in Europe demanded raw materials, things like cotton, rubber, minerals, and agricultural products. And Europeans also wanted markets, and they needed a place to sell those manufactured goods. So we see as nationalism grew, imperialism became popular at home. And after Italy and Germany unified by 1871, colonies became status symbols, proof that a union mattered. Just as important, industrial technologies made overseas conquest possible. So you have like steamships, move people and troops faster. Underwater telegraphs made communication quicker. We have inoculations, reduced deaths from malaria in tropical regions, and new weapons, breech loading rifles and machine guns. Those created a huge military advantage. So imperialism, it's not just an idea. It was supported by economic demands and industrial tools, but it also supported by changing beliefs. Earlier, Europeans often defined others mostly through religion, but the industrial era encouraged a more secular arrogance, a belief that Europe was simply more advanced and more modern. And there's some central aspects of racism in that. Stereotypes hardened, right? And we can see this is like European racial beliefs and stereotypes. Asians were depicted as cunning or deceitful, fueling yellow peril fears. Africans were labeled as permanently primitive. Pacific Islanders were portrayed as big children. And this new kind of racism developed, often called scientific racism. It claimed to rank people in a hierarchy of races with whites on top. Social Darwinism took evolutionary ideas and tried to apply them to human society as if domination proved fitness. And many Europeans framed empire as a moral responsibility, a civilizing mission. They described conquest and rule as progress, education, healthcare, Christianity, and good government. But notice the contradiction. People claimed they were helping while conquering, exploiting, and controlling. So let's talk about the second wave of European conquests. From about 1750 to 1900, European empires expanded strongly across Asia, Africa, and Oceania. And there were new imperial players. We talked about two of them already, like Germany and Italy, but now we have Belgium, the United States, and Japan. Often Europeans preferred informal control, so influence through trade, investment, and pressure. But competition between powers frequently pushed them toward direct conquest, and conquest usually depended on a military force, or at least the threat of it. So over the 19th century, European firepower grew dramatically. In war, after war, European powers usually won. But colonies were created in different ways. In India and Indonesia, empire grew through interaction with European trading companies. In much of Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, it came through deliberate conquest. Some decentralized African societies were hard to conquer, not because they were weak, but because they lacked like a centralized government that could be defeated easily. And there was resistance. The Zulu and the Boer War in South Africa. In the Pacific, competition among Britain, France, Germany, the Dutch, and the Americans drew in other powers too. And then there are settler colonies. Australia and New Zealand became more like North America, where you have like this massive European settlement and diseases that kill much of the native population. And beyond formal colonies, expansions into places like Siberia, the Amazon, Hawaii, and Polynesia brought disease to isolated communities that caused mass death. I want us to also include American imperialism because we were doing that as well. The United States, we expanded through war with Mexico, through removal and extermination of Native Americans, and through the annexation of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. We also hostile takeover of the Hawaiian Islands. We did that too. Japan built an empire in Taiwan and Korea in a very European style. Not every place was colonized, though. Ethiopia and Siam, or Thailand, avoided colonization using diplomacy and military strength. Now, once Europeans took control, what did colonial rule look like in daily life? So first, it was often incredibly traumatic. Loss of land, property, and life could be devastating, but colonialism also created choices. They were limited choices, but you did have a choice sometimes. Some individuals cooperated. People joined colonial armies. Local elites sometimes kept privileges by working with the new rulers. Colonial governments and missionaries prompted European education, and this produced a small Western educated class. So over time, colonial states relied on that educated group more and more. They were assimilating, right? And so a major example of this is, well, there's also rebellion. A rebellion never disappeared. Think about the Indian Rebellion of 1857 to 58, excuse me. So it was kind of like this mutiny that began amongst Indian soldiers, but it expanded, and some rebel leaders called for a revival of the older empire. So afterward, the rebellion widened racial divides in India. So you have to think about the caste system. It's also very alive and present in India. It also made the British more conservative and cautious about trying to reshape Indian society too quickly. So here's one of the most important arguments in this chapter. So it talks about like modern colonial empires were different from earlier empires. In modern colonial empires, race became a central dividing line. Rulers and ruled were separated by racial categories, especially in places with large numbers of European settlers like South Africa. So South Africa, keep in mind, South Africa is a nation. It's not just talking about like the region of South Africa. Think about the country South Africa. So colonial states also changed daily life and administration in deep ways. They were obsessed with counting and classifying their subjects. In India, colonizers often froze or simplified an idealized caste system. In Africa, they identified distinct tribes. Sometimes they even invented them. And these categories were not neutral. They shaped identity and politics, and gender also began to matter. Colonizers portrayed themselves as masculine, active, disciplined, strong, and framed colonized peoples as passive or feminine. European women were often presented as symbols of civilization, and some colonized groups were labeled marital races and recruited for colonial armies and police. So at the same time, colonial rule also contradicted Europe's like stated values. Colonies were basically dictatorships, and they rejected national independence, and racial classification contradicted Christian and those Enlightenment claims about human equality. And many colonizers didn't truly want colonies to modernize because that would threaten their control. So over time, these colonies, these contradictions really undermine that colonial legitimacy. So colonies also, like colonialism, transformed labor. The world economy increasingly demanded Asian and African raw materials. And so we see subsistence farming decline because people had to pay taxes in cash and because they wanted access to those imported goods. Local artisans were displaced by manufactured products, and Asian and African merchants were squeezed by Europeans. And across colonies, we can compare three major labor patterns. First, economies and coercion. Many colonial states demanded unpaid labor or public projects. The most extreme case, and you will read about this more in the chapters, the Congo Free State, personally controlled by Leopold II of Belgium. Not only does he mutilate the people there, like physical mutilation, it is horrible what he does in Congo. Labor demands and terror killed millions of people there. Forced labor caused starvation because people couldn't grow their own food. And Belgium finally took control in 1908 to end the worst abuses. But then we have another coercive system, and that's the Dutch cultivation system in Indonesia. Peasants had to devote part of their land to cash crops as a tax, and that helped finance the Dutch industrialization. Traditional authorities benefited by enforcing the system. But we also see deadly famines, and forced cultivation triggered resistance, like the rebellion of German East Africa in 1904 to 1905 against forced cotton. Second, we have cash crops. And those economies are shaped by markets. So in some places, farmers willingly expanded export production for profit, but cash crop specialization created dependence on one or two exports. And we see places like Ghana, where African farmers built this export boom, leading supplier by 1911. But then later, labor shortages produced exploitation and social tension. And then finally, we have wage and labor migration. So that spread across colonial enterprises. So in Africa, land seizures pushed migrants into wage work. South Africa's mines often offered harsh conditions. And tens of millions of Indians and Chinese migrated to work on plantations in the mines, and conditions were very dangerous and death rates were very high. So all of this, and there's a question, was colonialism development? And it's debated. Defenders argue it introduced infrastructure, schools, bureaucracies, and healthcare, and integrated colonies into global networks. But on the flip side of that, critics argue colonialism produced exploitation and uneven growth, and it rarely created full industrial breakthroughs in colonized societies. Colonialism didn't only change economics, it changed identity and how people believed and belonged. So education created new identities. Literacy could feel almost magical, and Western education could help someone escape forced labor, gain better work, and move into an elite status, but it also created these cultural divides between educated elites and then the majority. And many educated elites initially hoped colonial rule would modernize their societies. Over time, that became disillusioned, though. Religion also transformed identity. Christianity appealed for many reasons. Military defeat weakened older religious confidence. Christianity was tied to education and often created new opportunities for young people, the poor, and many women. Then you have Christianity taking on different forms depending on where it was in the world. So here are some key takeaways from this chapter. Modern imperialism was powered by industrial capitalism and military technology. It was justified through racism and a civilizing mission. It transformed labor and economies through coercion, cash crops, and migration. It shaped identity through education, religion, and classification, and it generated resistance that eventually undermined its empire. So that's the story of colonial encounters. A story of power, change, contradiction, and human agency. That is the answer to the quiz question. A story of power, change, contradiction, and human agency.